So you think you've pulled on that rope handle so many times that if the Olympics had a category for small engine starting, you could be team captain. Maybe I got a few things I can share with you to help you, diagnose what's wrong. So hang in there, guys. We're going to jump right into this video. Appreciate you stopping by today. Let's get to it. First, a little bit about myself. For several years, I operated my own outdoor power equipment repair business where we sold and serviced outdoor power equipment. I was certified through Briggs & Stratton as a master service technician and through Kohler engines as a certified expert. Well, that doesn't mean I know everything or that I'm always right. Far from it. It just means that over the years I've seen a few things, and some of those things I've seen over and over again. So I was hoping by making this video that I could kind of guide some of you along the path of what it means to troubleshoot and how the proper procedure is to go about troubleshooting. So we're going to jump right into it. I think we can probably break down most small engine problems into two categories. Number one, it won't start. Number two, it starts but won't stay running. For the purposes of today's video, we're going to concentrate on number one. The engine will not start. So here we go. Let's get started. For our test mule, we have a Kohler Command Pro 14 horsepower single cylinder recoil start. Now, keep in mind that this is not a direct how-to to fix your exact piece of equipment. This video is to try to teach you how to troubleshoot. And it doesn't matter what the brand of the equipment is, what the manufacturer of the engine is. The procedures are applicable either way. So, we've got fresh fuel in the gas tank and the crankcase is full of oil. We're actually getting down into the troubleshooting part of it right now for a non-starting engine. And the first thing I'm going to reach for is a spark tester. I want to know if I have spark. So let's take a look at that. I don't know if I can do this one-handed or not, but we'll see. Oh, how about that? Alright, there's our spark plug. Looks good, not fouled out. Got the right color on the electrodes. Let's see if it has any spark. Got our spark plug laying behind this breather hose right here with the metal body of the spark plug, the threaded part, touching this metal valve cover. The body of this plug has to be grounded and the plug boot has to be stuck on the plug just like you would be if it was in the running engine. Now we're going to spin the engine over. I'm going to try and get down in there and we're going to watch for spark at that electrode. Here we go. Yep, I see it. Good spark. Alright, a quick word about spark testers. Some of you are probably wondering why I didn't reach for one, and in truth, when I was in the business, this was my number one go-to tool. Reached for it multiple times every day, every single day. The truth is, today's modern ignitions put a lot of voltage out, and the gap on a spark tester can be anywhere from 1/8 inch to almost 1/4 inch. If that coil is unable to jump that gap on the spark tester, it may find another way to ground, which means blowing out the side of the coil, your ignition coil to ground, in which case you've just torched your coil. So our far safer method is to use a spark plug. And spark plugs are cheap. You get these, very inexpensive, great troubleshooting tools. I recommend you keep a couple of spark plugs for whatever you're working on hand at all times. One more quick note. You sometimes hear folks claim that your spark looks weak or you've got a weak spark. Or they want it to be a fat blue spark with an audible crack to it when it jumps the gap. Well, in the old days that used to be a thing. But with today's modern ignition systems, it's not so much. If you've got a spark that will jump the 30 thousandths gap on your spark plug, that's good enough. It doesn't matter, what color it is or if you can even hear it audibly. If it'll jump that gap, it will ignite the air-fuel mixture in the cylinder. So try not to get too hung up on the color or the width of the spark. We've run our spark test. We've got great spark, which is exactly what I figured because there's nothing wrong with this engine. But what if you run the test and you don't have any spark? Well, we need to get into just a little bit of theory. Don't panic. We'll get back to it in just a minute, but this is important to the rest of this troubleshooting conversation. An ignition coil has two windings, a secondary or high voltage part of the coil, the winding, which is always grounded. Remember, we talked about how this spark plug had to thread down in to the block or in the cylinder head, and how it had to be laying against something metal to run our spark test. The secondary winding gets grounded. The primary or low voltage winding is not grounded, and that's where we're going to go with our troubleshooting. Anytime that we ground the primary side, we short the coil out and there's no spark. That's how the kill switch works on your small engine. It grounds out the primary winding. Okay, you with me so far? All right, let's jump back into it and we'll take a closer look at what I'm talking about. So I've taken all the sheet metal off this engine so we can get a better look at what's going on. We're going to come over here and we're going to look at this ignition coil. Let me move this out of the way so we can see it a little better. Right here is your ignition coil. You see this lead coming right there? Well, it actually, the other end of it, hooks to the spark plug. That is the secondary or the high voltage lead. You can see when I move it, that wire move. One end comes out of the coil right here. The other end goes to the spark plug. Secondary high voltage. And right down here, I hope I can get in there to see it. See this plug right here? This is the primary or low voltage side. I'm just going to slide it off. See, it's got a terminal right there on your ignition coil. And how this works is anytime this terminal is not grounded to the block or this engine, this coil should create a spark. And if we want to shut it off, we ground this terminal. That's what this wire does. It either grounds or ungrounds or supplies the ground to this terminal. Get it back on there. So how's that all work? Well, let me see if I can show you. See right here, this is our shutoff lever on this particular engine. You guys with woods and mills, you're going to recognize that. But this varies from engine to engine and application to application. It may be a key. It may be another type of letting go of a handlebar on a push mower. There's something that supplies the ground to this coil to shut it off. And in our case, it's this little micro switch right here with these two wires coming out of it. So if I unplug this again, this is the primary or low voltage side of this coil. Move that over there. I want to take my meter. I've got my handy fluke meter hooked up for a continuity check, an audible continuity check, so we'll be able to hear it. Get my leads. I'm just going to take one lead and just set it in here on the block. Let me do it somewhere where you guys can see it. I'll set it right there in that hole in the block. So that should be a good ground. The other lead, if I touch it to ground beside it, we should hear something. You guys hear that? Take it off. Touch it. I know this is basic stuff, guys. I'm just trying to help out, those who may not have as good a grasp on it as some of us do. Alright, so if I take my probe and I go into that wire that hooks to the low voltage side of our coil, you'll notice that we don't hear anything, which means that there is no ground on this wire that hooks to the ignition coil. So the engine should run. It should have spark. Now if I move the lever to the shut off position, we've got a ground. This little micro switch has supplied a ground to that wire and shut down our ignition system. Is there anything else on this engine, this one's pretty basic, that would supply a ground to shut that off, or a reason that we wouldn't have spark? Yep, there sure is. Let me hop out of here and I'll show you what it looks like. Right over here on the side of this particular engine, you see this green wire coming out of this silver piece here in the block. That is a low oil sending unit. It runs up into this postage stamp looking box. And this is the control module for this low oil sending unit. Alright, I hear you. I know what you're thinking. Anything with wires coming out of it, it's got to be bad, right? Well, not necessarily. It's there to keep you from running your engine low on oil and, causing a catastrophic failure. I know that the quick and easy fix is to unplug it or cut it loose. A lot of guys do. But I think we can troubleshoot without doing that. Let me show you. we go back to this harness, and I've unhooked it, we're going to take it all out of here if we can. There we go. Okay, it looks confusing, but there's really nothing to it at all. All these wires are doing the exact same thing. They are either supplying a ground to that ignition coil we looked at a minute ago, or they're not. I mean, that's really all there is to it. So how do you troubleshoot it? What's happening here is our kill switch, our shut-off switch, and our low oil, sending unit here are doing the exact same thing. They are connecting this ground to this terminal on the primary low voltage side of the ignition coil to shut the engine off. So when I move this, when I move it to the stop position, it grounds this terminal and shuts the engine off. When the oil runs out or runs low in the engine, it grounds this terminal and shuts the engine off. So if we're troubleshooting a no spark condition, we need to make sure that neither one of these two items are supplying a ground and shutting that ignition coil off. 4 things that could cause this engine not to have spark at this point. It could be, number 1, a bad ignition switch. 2, a bad oil sensor switch. 3, the wire that runs from the primary side of that ignition coil across the top of the engine could have a nick in the insulation. Maybe it's gotten pinched and it's shorted to ground. That could do it. Or number 4, the ignition coil itself has failed. Now, let's take a look at how we test all 4 of those scenarios. Remember what we talked about. This wire that we put the bolt back in that held the sheet metal on, this wire is grounded right to the block. It supplies the ground for both of the shut-off mechanisms on this engine. The ignition switch and the low oil sensor. They both use this ground. So to make my life a little easier, I'm going to take my meter and I'm going to clip on that so I can check continuity on our various switches. First off, we'll check the kill switch, the ignition shut-off switch. So I'm going to go to my ignition coil, I'm going to unplug it, and I'm going to take my other meter lead and I'm going to go right in there on it. You can see that there is no continuity, we don't hear the meter, so that coil should make spark. We'll move it to the off position on the lever. That shuts it off. That should have spark. That provides a ground to the coil. That'll shut it off. So, if we think the ignition switch is the problem, when we did that test right now, nothing would change. That ground would never go away. No matter what position we slid that switch in, it would always remain grounded, which would tell us that it had no run position anymore, something had failed in it, and that we needed to replace the ignition switch. Now let's move on to the low oil switch. I'll show you how to check that. So we've tested our on-off, our ignition switch, and it looks good. Let's check this oil level system and see if it's causing the problem. First thing we want to do is unplug this black wire. Again, we've got one end of our meter hooked to a straight ground. We're going to check and see if we have a ground on this black wire. This black wire plugs into this harness and it goes right over to that ignition coil that we were talking about just a second ago. So let's see. Alright, there's nothing there, which again, this engine's working fine, so we would expect that to be, to be the case. If you test that and you get a condition to ground, you want to check one more time and make sure that the oil level is full. And then you want to unplug this green wire if you have enough oil. You want to check the male plug on this green wire. If you do not have continuity, this module is bad. If you check that green wire and you do have continuity, the float or the sensor itself is the piece that's gone bad. They both work together. And that's how you separate which one is the culprit. So at this point, we've still got a no spark condition, but we've eliminated the possibility that it being the ignition switch or the low oil sensor. We've tested those thoroughly. We're convinced they're working just as they should. What's left? Well, it could be a bad ignition coil, but before we jump to the high dollar part, we need to check that wire that connects across the top of the engine and plugs into the coil. It's very simple to do. We're going to unplug our ignition switch. You saw us do that earlier. Take the wires off that little micro switch. We're going to unplug those two wires that go to the low oil sensor, and we're going to test that connection, that wire again at the ignition coil. If everything's unplugged and it still shows a continuity to ground or a connection to ground, then the wire's gotten pinched somewhere. Some insulation's missing. It's got a bolt that touched it. Something. We need to replace that wire. And it's rare, but it does happen. If that checks out okay, then by process of elimination, we're looking at the ignition coil. But there is one more thing we can check before we spend that money. If we've eliminated everything else, you know, there's no ground on this wire that plugs into the ignition coil right here, but yet we don't have any spark on our plug. When the engine turns over, there's no spark. We simply unplug that wire again and we turn the engine over. That's going to be kind of hard to do, obviously, but you can put the sheet metal, you can put the cover back on it temporarily, enough to pull the rope and spin it over. You can also take your drill and a socket, put in here on that. Do not use an impact, you know, a battery impact. Use your drill. You don't want to tighten that nut. We just want to turn the engine. So you can put a drill with a socket on it, chuck it up on there, spin the engine, being very mindful that you've got wires exposed. You don't want long sleeves, long hair getting caught in this with this sheet metal off, so be careful. Spin the engine over with this wire unplugged. Check for spark. If this wire is unplugged, this is the only wire that can shut this coil off, guys. This is the only wire that connects to all the devices that can kill the spark. This is it. So if you unplug it at the coil, turn the engine, and you still don't have spark, this coil has failed. It's the only thing left. It has to be the coil. And yeah, you do get a bad ignition coil from time to time. It happens, you know, but this is one way to pinpoint exactly what the problem is before you spend the money, because they tend to be pretty pricey. So there you have it. Small engine ignition basics 101. You know, I've done the job that we showed here today probably thousands of times over the course of my small engine career, but I've never tried to film it and stop and explain each step along the way. I found it remarkably difficult to do so. I felt like I was jumping around all over the place. So my hope is you were able to take something away from this video that will help you in your own small engine endeavors. I'm sure there's probably going to be questions. If you want to drop me a question in the comment, I'll be happy to try and answer it or maybe explain things in greater detail. A couple of items I want to talk about before we go. Today's engine used a magneto ignition. If the piece of equipment that you're working on uses a battery style ignition where it puts voltage to the ignition coils, what we talked about today is not applicable to you. So be aware of that before you start following the troubleshooting steps that we laid out here today. Number two, the engine in question had two shutoff devices. The irregular kill switch, that red lever, and the low oil sensor. Both of those would take the magneto to ground and shut it off. A larger piece of equipment, such as maybe a riding mower, may have a multitude of kill switches. It may have one on the clutch pedal, the brake pedal, the seat, the PTO. If it's a zero turn, you may have to fold the handles out or put them in a specific position. So, you know, it gets a lot more complicated from what we worked on here today, but this was just a basic troubleshooting class. And I want to reiterate what makes a good troubleshooter. Someone who can slow down, he or she can proceed methodically and work through the list and eliminate possibilities one by one until they arrive at the problem and are able to pinpoint a solution for it. Also, you might have noticed that I was working on a sawmill today. If you're at all interested in a sawmill, ever thought you might like to own one, I recommend giving the folks at Woodland Mills a call. This is not a sponsored video. They're not paying me to say this. They don't sponsor this channel. I just happen to own one of their sawmills It has been great for us. I really enjoy it. I think if you're in the market for a manual mill, you won't go wrong with the Woodland Mills. Well, guys, I'm going to wrap it up. It's been a long day. I have fought biting flies, 100-degree temperatures, and overheating cameras all day, and I'm ready to go to the house. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. We are growing the channel. We can't do that without your help. Drop us a comment below. Tell your friends about us. Every little bit helps. We very much appreciate it. Remember to get outside. It's good for you guys. Be nice to one another. We could use a lot more of that. And guys, I will see you on the next video.